Hi everyone! Welcome to the first episode of Baking Theory, where we discuss how baking works and all the science behind the magic of pastry. I'm Alia, or Cake Legend, and I hope you all enjoy. Today we're going to be talking all about cookies, their different characteristics, makeup methods, how they should be baked and stored, plus all the little factors that could affect the outcome. Let's start with the four main characteristics: crispiness, softness, chewiness, and spread. Looking at crispiness, we know these cookies are typically small and thin in size, which helps them dry out quicker in the oven while they're being baked. Sometimes they are also baked for a slightly longer period of time just to evaporate a little bit more of that moisture. But what else contributes to crispiness? You can start with a batter that is lower in moisture and therefore a stiffer consistency. Higher fat and sugar contents also contribute to crispiness and help mix a dough that has little moisture. Crisp cookies should be stored properly after they're baked and cooled so that they don't absorb any moisture from the air and soften up. Next, we'll look at the opposite characteristic, softness. These cookies will typically have a larger and thicker size. They may be slightly underbaked so that they retain more of the moisture from the batter. Batters that produce soft cookies will typically have a high liquid content and a lower amount of sugar and fat. When it comes to sugar, they will most likely contain something like honey, molasses, or corn syrup because these sugars are hygroscopic, meaning that they can absorb moisture a lot better than other sugars. Now let's talk about chewiness. In order for a cookie to be chewy, it needs to be soft. But remember that not all soft cookies are chewy. Like those gross Loft House cookies you can get at the grocery store, for example. Those may be soft, but they're not chewy at all. A batter that produces chewy cookies is usually high in sugar and liquid, but low in fat. A higher percentage of eggs is typically included, as well as a stronger flour. More mixing will also develop more gluten and contribute to the chewiness. And our last characteristic is spread. A cookie's ability to spread depends on a little more than just the quantities of ingredients, though higher sugar percentages will contribute to more spread, as well as higher amounts of chemical leaveners like baking soda. Another leavener that affects spreading is mechanical creaming. When you cream the ingredients in a mixer, you're incorporating air into the batter. The more air you incorporate, the more the cookie will spread. This is why cookie doughs like shortbread are barely creamed in the beginning, because you typically don't want those cookies to spread. However, if you're wanting to decrease the amount of spread, using a stronger flour and mixing a bit longer to develop some more gluten, without incorporating air, is the way to go. When placing your cookies on a baking sheet, make sure it isn't too greased up because that can also contribute to spread. When it comes to the baking part, a higher oven temperature will decrease the amount of spread because the cookies will set faster. If the oven is too cool, our cookies may spread a bit too much. Now that we've talked about the main characteristics of cookies, we're going to discuss the different mixing methods used in the making of the cookie dough. The most popular and commonly used method is the creaming method. This is when the sugar and butter are creamed together in the first step, along with the salt and spices, if they're included in the recipe. Then the eggs and liquids are incorporated on a low speed, and the flour is sifted in last. Remember that the amount of creaming can affect the leavening and spread of your cookies. The second mixing method is called the one-stage method, and it's quite simple. There are only two steps. First, scale all your room temperature ingredients into a mixing bowl, and then mix them on a low speed until everything is properly incorporated, making sure to scrape the bowl when necessary. This method isn't used as often because it's harder to control things like gluten development and the amount of air being incorporated into the mixture. Shortbread cookie dough is usually mixed using the one-stage method. The third mixing method is called the sanding method, and it also pretty much consists of only two steps. After scaling your ingredients, mix the dry ingredients with the fat on a low speed until it looks sandy, kind of resembling coarse cornmeal. Then add the eggs and mix until a uniform dough forms. You're probably wondering, what about the wet ingredients? Well, this mixing method is normally used for recipes that contain eggs as the only wet ingredient and no other liquids. Our fourth and final mixing method is called the sponge method. This procedure can vary based on what kind of cookies you're making and the ingredients required, but this method is what's used in the making of macaron batter. You start with scaling your ingredients and whipping the eggs with the sugar until it reaches the desired stage. For example, with macarons, you're usually looking for stiff peaks. After that, the rest of the ingredients are folded into the meringue. You should always be careful with this step so that you do not overmix or deflate your meringue too much. The sponge method is usually used in small batches because the batter is so delicate. As a general rule for mixing cookie dough, no matter which mixing method is used, you always want to make sure you're not overmixing the batter. This can develop too much gluten when it isn't desired and produce tough cookies. Follow the steps of your mixing method carefully to ensure all ingredients are properly incorporated. Improper mixing can lead to cookies being too crumbly, or they may even stick to your baking pans. The scaling of ingredients is also important. Ensure you aren't adding too many liquids or too many dry ingredients. Watch for the amount of air that's being incorporated into the batter and always keep in mind the type of cookie you're making. Now that we've discussed all the different ways of mixing your cookie dough, it's time to talk about the different makeup methods. We're going to be discussing 8 different methods today. The way you make up your cookies depends on the type of cookie they are, as well as the type of batter you have. First, let's talk about the one type of cookie we're all familiar with, dropped cookies. These are made from a batter that is soft and can be portioned out with a scoop or a spoon. Maybe you have a childhood memory of baking chocolate chip cookies with your mother and licking the spoon after you used it to scoop the batter onto the baking sheet. Yeah, those are what I'm talking about. This type of soft batter can also be portioned out with a piping bag, but it's not recommended if the batter contains inclusions like fruits, nuts, or chocolate chips. Anything that might clog the piping tip. A scoop is the best tool to use. The second type of cookie does require a piping bag though. These are referred to as bagged or pressed cookies. This type of dough is stiffer than dropped cookie dough. It should still be soft enough to be squeezed out of a piping bag, but stiff enough to hold its shape once piped. Next up, we have rolled cookies. These are your typical sugar cookies. They're made from a stiffer dough that's rolled out thin, and the cookies are cut using various shaped cutters. These cookies take a lot more time to make because of the procedure. This method also produces a lot of scraps, which toughen a bit every time they get re-rolled. The benefit though is that you can produce a large variety of sizes and shapes that can be decorated for any occasion. The fourth method is called the bar method, but I prefer to call it the biscotti method. This is when the cookies are baked in long, narrow strips and cut after coming out of the oven. They shouldn't be cut straight away, but it should still be done when they're warm. If you are making biscotti, the cut cookies are then put back into the oven to bake for a second time. The fifth method is called the icebox or refrigerator method. In this method, the cookie dough is rolled into logs and kept in the fridge or freezer. Whenever fresh baked cookies are needed, the logs are sliced up and baked. Simple as that. A slicing machine can be used for maximum consistency in size, but they shouldn't be used on a dough that contains inclusions like nuts. In that case, we gotta resort back to our trusty dusty knives. The icebox method can also be used to make multicolored cookies with different designs, such as checkerboard. Next, we have the molded method. These cookies are made from a stiffer dough similar to the consistency of a rolled cookie dough. The dough is rolled into a log, chilled, and cut into pieces, just like before, but They are then placed on a baking sheet and flattened with a weight dipped in sugar. This can also be done with a fork, a special mold, or even just your hands. The seventh method is the sheet cookie method. There is no one single procedure when it comes to sheet cookies. They are typically more dense and rich than the other cookies we've discussed. The batter is spread out in a sheet pan and baked just like that. After it's cooled off, an icing can be applied if desired, and the giant cookie sheet is cut into individual squares or rectangles. Of course, the sheet should always be removed from the pan before cutting so that you don't damage the pan. And the last makeup method is called the stencil method. This one is only used for a special type of cookie made from a soft dough, often called stencil paste. The batter is spread over a stencil on top of a silicone baking sheet, then baked after the stencil is removed. An example of a stencil cookie is tuile. Now that we've talked about the makeup methods, let's go over some guidelines for baking and cooling your cookies. When it comes to the baking pans, you always want to make sure they are clean and unwarped. Instead of greasing the pan, it's much faster and easier to use either parchment paper or a silicone mat. If you do bake your cookies directly on the pan, remember that a heavily greased pan will increase the spread of your cookie. When it comes to actually baking the cookies, most are baked at a relatively high temperature for a short period of time, usually around 175 to 190 degrees Celsius, or 350 to 375 Fahrenheit. Definitely make sure your baking temperature isn't too low, because remember, that can increase the spread of your cookies as well. Using a higher temperature will decrease the spread, but if you're not careful, you could also burn the edges or bottoms of your cookies. Cookies can burn within a single minute of overbaking. If you notice that the bottoms of your cookies are getting too dark while the tops still remain pale, you can always double tray them. After they're removed from the oven, the heat of the pan will continue to bake the cookies a little bit longer, so don't be afraid to take them out a bit earlier. Cookies are usually done when you can see that the edges and bottoms are just turning a light golden color. If the cookies do come out a little too dry, it might be because they were baked too long, or the oven temperature could have been too low. When the temperature is too low, the cookies need to be in the oven longer to develop their golden edges, but being in the oven longer will evaporate more moisture than desired. However, a cookie could also end up too dry because of the dough. Maybe it didn't have enough liquid or enough fat. Maybe it had too much flour. If your cookies are also coming out too brown, then you know it's most likely an oven issue. However, it could also be because the formula contains a little too much sugar. When you're cooling the cookies, it's best to leave them on the pans until they are firm enough to handle. Some cookies are very soft when hot, but become crisp once they cool. If the cookies are baked directly on the pan though, they should be removed while they're still warm so that they do not stick. If your cookies do happen to stick to the pans, it could be because they were improperly greased, or the dough might not have been mixed properly. Or sometimes it's because the dough contains too much sugar. And of course, the cookies shouldn't be stored in containers or any kind of packaging until they have cooled off completely. So that's basically it. Cookies are small, delicious, and quite easy to make. As long as you follow the steps in your recipe, you can't go wrong. But I hope this video helped provide some insight on why those procedures are the way they are. Why some cookies turn out very tender and crumbly while others are soft and chewy. How different ingredients affect the characteristics, and how one little alteration in the recipe can have a big change on the final product. Thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to hit the like button for more videos like this, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next video. Happy baking!